Hello and welcome back to Booklust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today is Susan Straight, and we'll be talking about many of her books, but especially her new book just out, Sacrament. Susan, thank you so much for coming onto the show today.
I'm a huge fan, Nancy. My mom taught me to read when I was 3, and then the next day took me to my local public library, where I still go now.
Well, I have to say I'm such a fan of yours because one of my favorite books that I still remember how much I loved it was one of your very early books. It wasn't your first book, but it was I've Been in Sorrow's Kitchen and Licked Out All the Pots, which should have won an award for the best title. It's such a terrific title. And when
The title came from my mother-in-law, which was funny. I got married really young. I met my future husband when I was in a freshman year of high school on the school bus. But my mother-in-law was maybe born in Mississippi, maybe born in California, maybe born in Oklahoma. And in her kitchen, when we were all cooking, somebody older would always say, "Oh, I'm not worried about that. I've been in Sarah's kitchen and looked at all the pots." And I thought, well, that's a great phrase. If she's saying she doesn't care at all anymore, I like that.
Yeah. When you talked about your mother-in-law just now and that it was so sort of unclear where she came from, I read, after I finished Sacrament, I went back and reread In the Country of Women, which is both a memoir, but it's also, well, how would you describe it?
Wow. One of my favorite books is Deborah Miranda, Bad Indians, published by Heyday. And yeah, I think both Deborah Miranda, who's writing about being Indigenous in California, and I were trying to place our family history and our personal history, but always in terms of the landscape. So you're right, it's a memoir, but not of me necessarily, but of all these women that came from, Switzerland, my mom, my grandmother that I never met, who went to the prairies of Colorado, and then my mother-in-law's family, which began, of course, during enslavement in Mississippi. And I think it's a memoir of America in itself, because it's that journey that women made to cross the country and get to Southern California, just like men did, but no one ever talked about the women.
Right.
I remember thinking about that when I was little. My mother would be very adamant. She's a tiny woman from Switzerland. She's 90, she'll be 91 next month, and I take care of her in the afternoons because she has dementia. But she's still just as adamant, even with dementia, that no one ever wanted to listen to her stories. And so maybe that's the part of the memoir that feels different.
Yeah, it was sort of loving and respectful of the strength of the women that you write about. I was very moved by it.
Thank you. And I think for me raising 3 daughters, one of the things I can say to you, because I trust you, because you love books too, is that like I grew up, books were my companion. I was the oldest of 5 kids in my mom's family. My dad had left us, and then I was the youngest of 5 kids if I would go visit my dad, so there was no way to win there. Either I was doing all the chores for 5 kids younger than me, or I was getting beat up by the 4 older stepkids. But books were my companion, and the idea of what a memoir is and the idea of what women's stories are came to me early on through all those great books, Anne of Green Gables. But A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Nancy, was the one that I kept reading over and over, because Francie's mother was fierce. She was not, this tender, loving mom. She was very fierce, and she would protect her daughter at all costs. And you remember that scene where she shoots the guy who's trying to drive?
Yes.
I
Yeah.
never forgot that. And
Me either.
no, I thought, if I'm going to be a mom of 3 daughters, I want to write a memoir that has the truth in it, and it is respectful, but there's also a lot of hard parts in there about, what happened to us. And my daughter said, "Why didn't you ever tell us these things that happened to you?" And I said, "Because we don't tell our daughters, we tell our friends and our sisters." And I say this all over the country when I go talk, especially to young women. But I've been to Turkey and Mexico City to talk about violence against women, and all women say, "No, I would tell my friends or my cousins. I would tell them in the car. I would tell them in the kitchen, but I would never tell.
Yeah, yeah. In that memoir, In the Country of Women, in that sort of story of women in the world that we know today, you talk about your becoming a writer, and one particular writer who was so important to you, one of your teachers. Could you talk about that? Because that's another, we always talk about mentors, so I think that's important too.
Well, interestingly, I had read James Baldwin, when I was 10, 11 years old. I read Go Tell It on the Mountain, and I still have that original copy. I mean, you could buy paperbacks at, the grocery store.
Yeah.
And so, first of all, I read Sula by Toni Morrison when I was 12 as well. Those original books are still, I thought their covers were beautiful, and they were 50 cents. And so I used the money that I got from babysitting and cleaning houses to buy books. And remember the rotating paperback?
Yes, I do. The spinner racks, that's what they were called.
And the other favorite book of mine is Sounder. So these three books are still on my desk, like the original paperbacks that I bought. But I would have never imagined that I would have met James Baldwin. But what I loved from a little kid reading Go Tell It on the Mountain, which I didn't understand all of it, was these multiple points of view. Like, you're all the way inside John's head, and he's vacuuming, the carpet. And I knew nothing about a place like New York or a carpet like that. But this idea of what his neighborhood was so similar to mine. The boys, including my younger brother who died very young and violently, in my neighborhood, there were no girls. There was only three of us. And then the boys just ran wild, and they were doing scary, terrible things. And I watched them from outside, like the screen of my window. And I thought, James Baldwin is writing about this kind of thing, this same thing. So I never thought I would meet him. But yes, when I went to graduate school, I was already married. I got married very young to the guy I met on the freshman bus. And I was in graduate school, and here was James Baldwin, just as kind and also just so patient and philosophical. And so I love telling my students now. I have a student right now, a graduate student from Uganda, Gleda Namukasa, and she's been struggling with this book. And finally, I sat down with her and I said, "This is about the secondary characters. That's why you're stuck, because you don't know where the plot goes." And she looked at me, and I had tears in my eyes. And I said, "Because I was taught that by James Baldwin, this thing that people don't often think about. You think you have a plot and you have main characters, but the secondary characters are who really moves the world along in our lives too." And so he was really a kind mentor to me. He came to our house for dinner. I'll never forget this, Nancy. We were so poor. We lived in married student housing, and it was like gray linoleum, 1-bedroom married student housing in Amherst. And he said, "This is so bad. It reminds me of my first apartment in Harlem." And so I like coming here. And I was like, okay. So I cooked lasagna, and he brought a bunch of friends, and my then husband had to work night shift. And so he was not a happy camper that all these famous writers were in the house, but he did his best. And James Baldwin wandered over. I had a card table. I wrote on a card table by a window, and I had a boombox, the old black boombox.
Uh-huh.
I had this quote. It said, "With the rhythm it takes to dance to, what we have to live through, you can dance underwater and not get wet." And he stood there. It was just handwritten, and I had taped it to the window. And he said, "This is the most profound thing I've read in many years." And he said, "Who wrote this?" And I said, "George Clinton." And he said, "Who's that?" And I said, he's a songwriter and band leader. And so he said, "I need to hear him." So I played him Funkadelic, Octo Boogie in the kitchen. And he said, "You have to write about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Wow.
The boombox made itself known in two of my first short stories. He read them both, and those were the stories that he helped me with.
Well, when you talk, first I want to say that I went to my neighborhood drugstore to buy a copy, to sneak out and buy a copy of Peyton Place. And that was 50 cents or 75 cents maybe, because it was so thick, as I remember it. But I couldn't show my parents my mother when I came home. So yes, I do remember that kind of thing. So your new book, Sacrament, when you talked about the secondary characters, these and inhabiting different points of view, so you see the different points of view. You put that sort of all together so wonderfully in Sacrament. So Sacrament is set at the beginning in August of the first COVID year. You know, I think probably a lot of you could describe this as saying it's a COVID novel, but it's not just a COVID novel. You know, it's a novel about these three women who are nurses who are sacrificing everything to care for these patients with no end in sight, because that was so much before there was a vaccine. And I know you brought forward a character, at least one character from Mecca. You have brought forward him, which I was very grateful for, because I too had a big crush on him. Yeah, right. So I was glad to see him appear in this book. But where did the idea for this come from?
Well, and I have to tell you that so Mecca, my previous book, ends 3 weeks before Sacrament starts. And
Yeah.
Johnny Frias, I had hundreds of emails from women readers saying, why can't Johnny Frias have a woman? Like, why can't he find love? I mean, Mija, come on. Like, right? Let him fall in love. And so I was like, okay, I'm actually going to think about that, because I came close in Mecca. But yes.
Right. Yeah.
So it's so nice to talk to someone who's a deep and concentrated reader like you are, because that's how I am too. And the polyphonic novel, which is something, again, I love that word, because no one really talks about how James Baldwin, you know, even with If Beale Street Could Talk, you're talking about multiple points of view.
Right.
And I love explaining to my students how that lets us use even landscape as a point of view, right? So Mecca ends, and Lorette Embers is an ICU nurse, and her husband Grief, who's an animal control officer, have been having to leave their son Dante, you know, in little brief times during COVID. And Dante is a character that is in Mecca, and he's a young kid. He's 13. But Lorette is somebody I've been writing about for a long time. I've been writing all these pieces about her, and she's a nurse in the ICU. She sings beautifully, and she's one of those women who sang since high school. And then, you know, she sings in like the Rialto Community Players. And, you know, there are so many women who sing beautifully in every community. There will be a woman who sings better than anyone you can hear on the radio. And so I kept thinking about her, and she loved to sing when she was in high school, and she married Grief very young. She used to force him to answer her with lyrics to things like, you know, my favorite things, and he would have to come up with lyrics. That was her test. So I loved the two of them. They remind me of all the people I went to high school with. You know, all my friends are still like this. So Lorette sings to patients when they're in a coma during COVID. And you're right. Like, I was really scared to write about COVID. I was afraid that publishers would say, oh my gosh, you know, we don't want to think about COVID, but we still read about World War II. We still read about World War I. I will read anything about the Dust Bowl. I will read anything about the Holocaust. I will read anything about the Great Depression. And I feel as if there was not yet a COVID novel, but a novel that talked about what it was like to be nurses, but also what it was like to be the family members. Because I had COVID 3 times. My ex-husband almost died of COVID. My next door neighbor had COVID the day before they knew what the name COVID was. And he fell over in my parking strip, and the ambulance came to take him away. And his wife and I, we couldn't touch him. Like, we couldn't go help him up. And that was, you know, nurses would FaceTime us from the hospital. And when my ex-husband was in the hospital for his week where he almost died, it was the nurses who FaceTimed us. And so all of this together made me think about this disconnect in a different way. Like, people have talked about, I moved away. But truthfully, I've had people tell me COVID was the best thing that ever happened in my life. And for for me, I lost my neighbors, I lost friends, I lost relatives. My across the street neighbor, Jim Calderon, died in his house and was taken out in a body bag while me and the other neighbors watched. And he had diabetes. He had lost both of his legs. I have a friend who kept telling her brother to go to the hospital. He was 35 and he didn't do it. And finally, when he drove himself, he pulled over on the side of the road and died in his car.
Uh,
No one found him for a while. And those are stories that I think you don't hear. And that's where Johnny Frias comes in because he's patrolling the roads. But Lorette is asked to sing to the patients, and she sings all those old school songs because
yeah.
that's my community, Art LeBeau, Killer Oldies, Lowriders. And so I just go with that, even though I was scared to write about the actual thing that nurses do. They turned over these giant men onto their stomachs so they could breathe. And I mean, men, these are big, big men. And yeah, they were turned over onto their stomachs. And my nurse friends and neighbors would tell me how tender the backs of these large men were. They would say, when I turned him over, you wouldn't believe how soft his skin was. And I couldn't get that out of me.
Yeah, I think the sacrifices that the nurses made, I think in some ways we've forgotten that. We've forgotten what it was like before vaccinations, before COVID, before we knew what it was and how to prevent it, if you will. And you brought that back so you sort of, it was like visceral. Like I sort of took me back to that time, when my daughter-in-law and my daughter called and said, no, you can't go to that restaurant. This was in March of 2020. No, you can't go to that restaurant. You can't go anywhere. Stay home. But the other thing that you do in this book, which I really appreciated, was you wrote also from the point of view of teenagers who really didn't understand. How could they? And it just seemed to me, you just got them so right, that kind of craziness thinking that happens.
I mean, again, I learned so much from James Baldwin about who drives the engine, even in our own hearts while we're writing. And I had Lorette, who sings, and then her cousin Charisse, who is a widow and who's much more like hardcore and likes her tequila, and she and her daughter are together. Like that's the family unit. She's never gotten married again. And so then I kept thinking about her daughter because these nurses go live in RVs. And so that also happened. Like on my block,
Yeah.
traveling nurses who had rented rooms. And also on the next block and the block after that, people would park RVs and donate them so that nurses could walk. The hospital is only 3 blocks from my house. That's where I was born and where everybody was going. And so it was very intense. I know in New York, people would talk about sirens constantly going by, and that's how it was for me as well. But then these nurses would literally walk by my house at like 6 p.m. on their way to 7 p.m., 12-hour shift. And then they'd walk back on the way home, and I'd be out in the yard with the dog. I also had my three of my grown kids were living at the house, and they would tell me these amazing stories, but then they were so lonely. They would be FaceTiming their kids, and they'd say, oh, here are Susan's sunflowers. Here's Susan's dog. Look, here's Susan waving hi to you.
Right.
Like, for 3 months. So Raquel, the daughter of Charisse, is really upset when her mom goes to live in this RV because she's 15 and she can't stay in the house by herself. And so she's shipped out to the Coachella Valley. And I've written about Coachella many times. That was a main location in Mecca as well. And suddenly I realized, well, of course, her mom was married to someone from Torres Martinez. And so there is Raquel, a prickly 15-year-old, and she's living with her 82-year-old great aunt.
Right.
She is out in the heat. It's 120 in August in Coachella, and the date harvest is going on. And, Nancy, again, like I don't hang out with writer. I mean, I hang out with my neighbors and my family, and we never talk about books, but it's fun to say this to you. I was like, what's Raquel gonna do out here? And all of a sudden here comes Joey Ortiz, and he's like up in the date palms, he's harvesting, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, here's Joey. And
Right.
I thought, why can't I write about what it's like to be a 15-year-old girl who's sent out to the middle of nowhere and who's been doing everything on STEM Academy virtual, which just was
Yeah.
soul killing. And she just came to me, and she ended up being one of my favorite characters I've ever written. So
Well, the other thing about that book is I felt like I learned so much about dates and the date harvests, and I have to say, it never occurred to me. But I mean, I felt like I learned so much. It was great.
yeah, we're not famous for too much in Riverside County that people would remember, but I will tell you that 99% of all dates that are grown in America and they're shipped across the world are grown in Coachella Valley. And I've been going out there since I was 5. My mom, being from Switzerland, thought that the Coachella Valley was heaven because it was 120 degrees, and she grew up freezing in the Alps of Switzerland. And so she would drag us out there, and we would get dates. And also, dates were such a huge deal for people who grew up in a cold winter. That date. So I have been to the date gardens many times on reporting assignments. I've written about this particular date garden over 10 years. And some of the favorite things I learned is that when you harvest the date blossoms, I was there when the Palmeros, the Barberin family, originally from Michoacan in the 1900s, they cut the blossoms, and thousands of bees would follow us, and they put it on a flatbed, and we just kind of ran. And there were just thousands of bees because you have to lock the huge date blossoms, which are 6, 7 feet long, and they look like peacock tails. And you lock them in a shed so that the bees don't steal all the pollen. And then the palmeros extract the pollen and spray it onto the date palm. I mean, once I learned that, I was like, how can I not
Right.
dates?
Right. But I didn't even think that American dates were shipped like to Turkey. Susan Straight, her new book is Sacrament. It's a sequel of sorts to Mecca, but they're totally self-standing. You don't have to read one before the other. And she gets, what Susan does so well is get at the hearts of her characters. And I think if you're somebody who loves character-driven fiction, as I do, that you're a writer to get to know. So thank you.
Thanks so much. It was so much fun to talk to you.